The universe has a rhythm. Most people can't hear it, but I always could. It's in the elegant arc of a thrown stone, the patient geometry of a crystal, the perfect, silent spin of a distant galaxy. For me, physics was never about a career. It was about learning the grammar of creation. And here, at the bottom of the world, I had found its most beautiful and terrifying verse. On my screen, the numbers scrolled in a river of green light, the only light in my small cabin. They weren't just data points. They were a fingerprint, a signature left by something our science had no name for. Out on the ice, 2 kilometers beneath our feet, was a magnetic anomaly, a warp in the Earth's field so powerful it shouldn't exist. My job, as the expedition's geophysicist, was to translate its language. The walls of my room were bare except for the papers I'd taped up. Spectrographic charts of nebulae, high-resolution images of dead stars, and the clean, beautiful math that described them. To my right, a single, thick porthole showed nothing but the endless Antarctic night, a blackness so complete it felt like a solid thing. My world was small, functional, and devoted, a monk's cell at the altar of discovery. A quiet chime broke my concentration. A message from Gunnar, my mentor and the head physicist of Icebreaker Station. The words were brief. "Finch, we're a go, chamber in 15. I pushed back from my desk, the chair's rollers silent on the grated floor. A current of anticipation ran through me, a feeling like the sharp air of the polar plateau hitting my lungs. This was it. For months, we had tiptoed around the anomaly, taking readings, running models, mapping its edges from a safe distance. Today, we would reach out and touch it. We would turn on the generator, our custom-built instrument designed to create a sympathetic resonance with the field, and for the first time, truly observe its core structure. To understand something is to have a gentle mastery over it. That's what I believed. The thought was a comfort. I pulled on my station jacket and stepped out into the main corridor. Icebreaker Station was a collection of heavy-duty modular pods linked together, all resting on massive hydraulic stilts that kept us above the shifting glacier. Ahead, in the mess hall, Leo Galloway was tending to the hydroponics bay. He was our comms officer, barely 25, and the greenest member of the crew, both in experience and in the thumbs he was trying to develop. The bay was the station's only real attempt at faking a natural world, a humid, glassed-in wall of struggling lettuce and herbs under a bank of pale yellow lights. It was the only place that didn't smell like machinery. "Big day, Desmond," he said, looking up from a row of drooping basil. His smile was earnest, a little nervous. "The biggest," I said. I could see the reflection of the hydroponics in his eyes. He wasn't a scientist, not really. He was here because he was the best at keeping a signal locked on a satellite through a polar vortex. He wanted to get home. I wanted to understand why home and everything else existed in the first place. "You'll let me know when you guys make history?" he asked. "You'll be the first to know, Leo. I promise." I left him to his plants and continued toward the station's heart. The anomaly chamber wasn't in a pod. It was a place we had carved. A cage elevator took me down, a slow descent through a shaft bored deep into the ice. The walls of the shaft were raw, ancient, showing layers of compressed time. The elevator stopped. Its door slid open onto a cavern. The chamber was a dome of raw blue-white ice. In the center there wasn't a glowing portal or some crackling energy field like in the movies. There was just nothing. An empty patch of air. All of our science, all of our ambition was aimed at this void. A web of sensors, gravimeters and quantum tunnelers sat on tripods, their lenses and detectors focused on a single point in space. This was my church. Gunnar was already there, his gaunt frame hunched over a monitoring console. "Field is stable. Ambient resonance is within expected parameters. You're ready to shed some light on this thing, Desmond?" "More than ready," I said, taking my place at the primary geophysics terminal. Gunnar was a pure intellect, sharp and brilliant and utterly devoid of sentiment. He saw the universe as a data set to be conquered. Where I saw poetry in the anomaly's signal, he saw a puzzle that was insulting him by remaining unsolved. We were a good team. He provided the ruthless drive. I provided the insight. Powering up the primary emitter. His voice was all business. Sequence initiated. A low tone began to build in the chamber, a pure sine wave. I watched my screen. The chaotic scribble of the anomaly's baseline signal began to change. The lines smoothed out, resolving themselves into a breathtakingly complex, perfectly ordered wave pattern. It was happening. We were seeing it. The feeling was electric, a surge of pure, intellectual triumph. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Then, a high, piercing alarm cut through the air. "What is that?" Gunnar snapped, his head whipping toward a secondary console. "Power conduits. We're getting a resonance cascade in Sector Gamma." On my own screen, a dozen warning indicators flashed red. The stable wave pattern I had been admiring was starting to fray, oscillating wildly, a feedback loop. The energy we were putting in was being amplified and fired back at us, threatening to overload every system in the station. "Shut it down," Gunnar ordered. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were locked on my console. The cascade had a rhythm, a pattern. It was a complex problem, but the solution felt simple, obvious. I wasn't thinking. I was just acting. I bypassed 3 standard protocols, opened a raw command line, and rerouted the emitter's entire power flow through a tertiary shielding array we almost never used. It was a move that was technically possible, but not in any emergency manual. It was a solution born of a pure, instinctive leap of logic. The alarm stopped. The red lights vanished. On the main screen, the wave pattern snapped back into its perfect, elegant form. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by the soft tone of the emitter. Gunnar stared at his console, then at mine. He slowly walked over, his eyes tracing the lines of code I had just typed. "How did you know that would work?" he asked, his voice holding a note I'd never heard from him before. Not admiration, a kind of sharp, analytical curiosity. I looked down at my own hands, resting on the keyboard. They felt distant, like they belonged to someone else for a moment. I had no answer. "I just saw it," I said, the words feeling thin and untrue. I just understood. The explanation satisfied him. He grunted, turning back to his work, but I kept staring at my hands. The skill to do what I'd just done wasn't mine. I had never run that diagnostic, never even theorized that kind of bypass. The knowledge had just appeared in my head, fully formed, a gift from the beautiful, silent machine we had just turned on. A sign. I was the one who could interpret its language. And it was finally speaking to me. That feeling of unearned genius lingered as the elevator carried me back to the world of pressurized air and human voices. I had saved the project, but it was more than that. I had communed with the anomaly. For a fleeting second, the universe had whispered a secret, and I had been the one to hear it. Hours later, the station was settling into its quiet, overnight rhythm. Most of the crew were in their bunks. I was in the mess hall, the only one there, a mug of coffee growing cold beside my laptop. The initial data from our experiment was breathtaking. The patterns were so clear, so elegant. I felt a profound sense of purpose, a calm satisfaction that smoothed over the unsettling memory of my own hands acting without my permission. I was working on my preliminary report, a summary for the consortium back in Europe. I detailed the initial power-up, the stability of the field, the sudden violent resonance cascade. I described the flashing red lights, the wail of the alarms. Then I came to the part where I had intervened. How could I explain it? An intuitive leap based on spectral harmonics? A novel diagnostic approach derived from the cascade's periodicity? It sounded like nonsense. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. I'd been awake for 22 hours. My brain felt like a worn-out muscle. Leaving the cursor blinking on the screen, I got up and walked to the galley for a fresh mug. When I returned and sat down, the screen was different. The paragraph was finished. 4 sentences stood where the blinking cursor had been. They were crisp, technical, and perfectly accurate, describing the exact power rerouting I had performed. They even referenced the specific subprocessor in the tertiary shielding array that handled the load, a detail I hadn't consciously known. The phrasing was mine. The cadence of the sentences felt like my own. But I had not written them. A sensation like cold water filled my stomach. I looked around the empty mess hall. My own reflection stared back from the black glass of the hydroponics bay. I must have typed it. Before I got up. A fugue state, a moment of automatic writing brought on by sheer exhaustion. It was the only logical explanation. I read the sentences again. They were better than what I would have written, more concise, more certain. The scuff of boots on the grate made me start. It was Greta, one of our engineers, striding past the doorway. She held a long silver torque calibrator, its small digital screen dark. She was talking to it, or to herself, a habit of hers when a system fought back. "I swear I locked it in the Gamma Bay diagnostic kit," she said, shaking her head as she vanished down the corridor. "I have never taken a tool to my bunk." I turned back to the screen. The 2 events connected in my mind with a clean, unpleasant click. A misplaced calibrator. A paragraph I didn't remember writing. People get tired. They forget things they did on autopilot. The station was a pressure cooker. We were all feeling the strain. It was the only answer that made sense. But a dissonance remained, a thin current of wrongness that logic couldn't warm. Still, the intellectual residue of my success in the chamber was stronger, a bright stain on my memory. That feeling of absolute clarity. What if this wasn't fatigue? What if it was a side effect, a gift? Perhaps my mind, now touched by the anomaly's perfect orderly signal, was simply becoming more efficient. It was filling in the blanks for me. It was solving problems before I was even aware they existed. The fear began to recede, replaced by a current of something else. Something thrilling. I highlighted the 4 sentences. For a moment, I considered leaving them. They were perfect. But then I hit the delete key. The words vanished. The cursor blinked on the empty line. I wasn't going to let my tired brain take credit for a discovery. I wanted to do it myself. I wanted to summon that clarity again, on purpose. I placed my fingers on the keys, took a breath, and reached for that feeling from the chamber. That clean silence where the answers lived. I was no longer just an observer. I was becoming part of the system. And I had to know how deep it went. The next few days were a lesson in how quickly wonder can curdle into dread. The gifts continued, but they lost their clean, intellectual beauty. A half-finished coolant report on my terminal was mysteriously completed, but in Gunnar's terse, clipped writing style. A schematic for a seismic sensor, which I'd been staring at for an hour, suddenly rearranged itself in my mind's eye, revealing a critical flaw I'd missed. Each event was helpful, a problem solved, but each solution left a feeling that my own mind was a house I no longer lived in alone. The glitches weren't just mine. Tools went missing and reappeared. Timestamps on data logs were off by minutes, then hours. We blamed solar flares, magnetic interference, human error. We clung to logical explanations like men clinging to a raft in a rising sea. And the sea rose on Tuesday. I was in the server hub, the station's brain, cross-referencing geological data. The air in the windowless pod was cold enough to see your breath, a necessary condition to keep the station's processors from overheating. Rows of server racks stood like black monoliths, their blinking diagnostic lights a constellation of green, amber, and the occasional red. Suddenly, a deafening sound erupted from the ceiling. White, billowing clouds of fire-suppressant gas flooded the room, instantly dropping the temperature to a painful cold. The gas smelled acrid, chemical. It was thick, obscuring the blinking lights, plunging the room into a disorienting white fog. An alarm went off, a frantic, synthesized voice repeating, "Fire event detected! Sector Delta, fire event detected!" I scrambled back from my console, shielding my face with my arms. But there was no fire, no smoke, just the biting cold and the choking gas. Then, through the thinning cloud, I saw a power console at the far end of the hub, the one that regulated the data feed from the anomaly chamber, sparked. A single, brilliant blue arc of electricity jumped from a conduit to the casing. The smell of burning plastic finally hit the air. The cause arrived after the effect. The fire suppression system hadn't responded to the event. It had anticipated it. That night, the mess hall was quiet. The 20 or so crew members who weren't on shift sat at the imitation wood tables, picking at their food with a shared, unspoken anxiety. The fire event was the only topic of conversation, spoken in worried tones. Leo was sitting across from me. "How does that even happen, Desmond? It's not possible." "There has to be a technical reason," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. "A sensor pre-failure, a cascade delay in the reporting." My voice trailed off. A few tables over, one of the maintenance techs, a quiet man named Corbin, was strumming a salvaged acoustic guitar. The chords were clumsy, hesitant. He was trying to pick out the melody of an old folk song and failing badly. Then, from the other side of the table, Mikhail, a burly geologist who barely spoke English, reached out. "Here," he grunted, "let me." Corbin, surprised, handed him the guitar. Mikhail settled the instrument in his lap. He was a man of brute force and seismic charts. I'd never seen him touch an instrument. His thick, calloused fingers, more suited to a rock hammer, hovered over the strings. And then he played. The music that filled the mess hall was not clumsy. It was fast, precise, and completely in control. A complex piece of classical fingerstyle I couldn't name. His hands moved with a steadiness and confidence that only comes from long repetition. The melody was haunting, full of a deep, aching sadness. Every person at every table fell silent. We watched, mesmerized and horrified. Mikhail played for a full minute, his eyes closed. When he finished, the final note hanging in the air, he opened his eyes and looked down at the guitar as if it were a venomous snake. A shudder ran through his body. He shoved the instrument back across the table at Corbin, a look of pure terror on his face. I don't know how," he stammered, in his thick accent looking at his own hands. "I have never played." The silence that followed was worse than the music. It was filled with a new and specific fear. This wasn't a glitch in a machine. This was a glitch in a person. "It's a mnemonic bleed," Gunnar said, his voice cutting through the tension. He was standing by the galley, a data slate in his hand. He wasn't looking at Mikhail's terrified face, but at his hands, as if they were a rare specimen. "The anomaly. It's not just warping causality, it's overwriting embodied knowledge, memory, skill." The name landed in the room and stuck. Mnemonic bleed. It gave a shape to the horror. It turned it from a series of random, unsettling events into a symptom. A disease. I looked around the room. People weren't looking at Mikhail anymore. They were looking at each other. At me. I had been the first. My intuitive leap in the chamber suddenly felt less like a gift and more like the first cough in a plague hospital. The trust that held our small society together was evaporating before my eyes, replaced by a single terrifying question. Who's next? Mikhail sat motionless, staring at his own treacherous hands. Gunnar, meanwhile, tapped his data slate. his expression one of pure, unadulterated academic hunger. He saw a phenomenon to be documented. The rest of us saw a disease. Greta, the engineer who had lost her calibrator, was the first to give the fear a voice. She stood up. "The station has a biological quarantine protocol," she said. We all knew it. A set of procedures for isolating contaminants, for sealing off pods and people. It was designed for a virus, a radiation leak, not for this. "If the mnemonic bleed is an informational contagion," she continued, her eyes sweeping across the room, landing for a moment too long on Mikhail, then on me, "then we need to treat it as such. Containment." The word resonated. Containment. Isolation. The silent accusation was clear. I was the geophysicist. I was the one most directly connected to the anomaly's data stream. I had been the first to show a symptom. The crew looked away when my eyes met theirs. I wasn't their brilliant colleague anymore. I was a vector. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick with suspicion. I pushed my chair back, the screech of its legs against the floor loud in the quiet, and walked out without a word. I needed to get away from the lights of the mess hall, away from the staring, frightened eyes. I didn't take the main corridor. I ducked into a service hatch and lowered myself into the maintenance conduits. This was the station's unconscious, a network of narrow, chest-high tunnels that ran beneath the floors. It was a maze of pipes, ducts, and junction boxes, lit by caged yellow utility lights spaced just far enough apart to leave pools of deep shadow in between. No one came down here unless they had to. It was perfect. I moved through the dim labyrinth, my hand trailing along an insulated pipe for balance. I wanted to think. I wanted to find the rational explanation, the scientific model that would make this all make sense again. But my thoughts weren't clean and logical. They were frayed, panicked, the mnemonic bleed. It wasn't a gift, it was an invasion, a foreign consciousness grafting itself onto my own. And it was spreading. That's when the thrum of the machinery changed. It wasn't a mechanical shift. The sound seemed to thin out, to lose its bass, as if I were listening to it through a cheap speaker. The air in front of me shimmered, like heat haze rising from hot asphalt. But the air down here was freezing. The shimmering thickened. It coalesced, knitting itself together into the shape of a man. He was tall, dressed in a station jacket identical to my own, but it was frayed, scarred with burn marks I didn't recognize. His face was a landscape of old wounds, a long, pale scar cut diagonally across his features, from his right temple to his left jaw. His skin was pulled over his bones, and his eyes were ancient, filled with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight in the narrow tunnel. He wasn't a ghost. He felt solid, real, but his edges flickered like a bad video signal. I was frozen. My entire survival instinct screamed at me to run, but the tunnel was too narrow. There was nowhere to go. He took a step toward me, his movements weary but certain. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He seemed familiar. His lips moved, but the sound that came out was distorted, a crackle of static and layered whispers. It took my brain a moment to assemble the words. "The Southern Truss groans," he rasped, the voice like grinding stones. "It will sing soon. When it does, don't let Leo be the one to answer." He looked at me for a moment longer, his ancient eyes holding mine. There was no malice in them, only a vast, terrible certainty. Then, as quickly as he had formed, his image began to dissolve. The solid lines of his body unraveled back into shimmering air. The static of his voice faded back into the thrum of the conduits, and he was gone. The air returned to its normal state. I stood there for a long time, his words looping through my mind like a warning I hadn't finished hearing. A single drop of sweat traced a path down my spine. The fear I felt wasn't just of the man or the warning, it was the chilling sense of recognition. I knew the scar on his face. I had seen it before, a phantom image reflected in the dark glass of a dead console. I had seen it in my own reflection. I scrambled out of the service hatch and back into the main corridor. The clinical white light of the pod felt harsh, alien. My own breathing was loud in my ears. The ghost's words were a repeating loop in my mind, a smooth stone turning over and over. It was a hallucination. It had to be. A stress-induced phantom born of paranoia and exhaustion. And the face. The scar. I had imagined it, a detail pulled from some movie and projected onto the shadows of the tunnel. It was the only rational explanation. I clung to it. But for the rest of the night, I couldn't work. I sat at my terminal, the anomalies beautiful, ordered data scrolling on the screen, but I saw none of it. I was listening past the ever-present thrum of the station, listening for a new sound. I heard it the next morning. A deep metallic ache from the station's bones, a groan. I looked up at the ceiling. We were in the central pod. The sound was coming from the direction of the southern corridor link. My focus narrowed until the sound was the only thing in the universe. I tried to reason with it. Icebreaker Station was a dynamic structure on a moving glacier. It was designed to groan and shift. It was normal. But then the groan sharpened, its pitch rising. It was becoming a note. A voice cut through the air. Gunnar's over the station-wide comms. "Galloway, we have a fluctuating pressure sensor on the gantry in the south corridor. Go run a visual check on the mounting." The world seemed to slow down. I saw Leo get up from the comms station across the pod, giving Gunnar a quick, "On my way." He grabbed a diagnostic tablet and headed for the corridor. He was answering. A jolt went through me, so powerful it felt like my heart had been shocked back into rhythm. I was on my feet, moving before I had made a conscious decision to do so. I wasn't running, but my strides were long and urgent. I caught up to Leo just as he stepped into the south corridor, a long, arched tube connecting us to the geo-surveying pod. High above, the heavy support gantries were visible, a network of thick metal beams. "Wait." Leo turned, a look of mild surprise on his face. "Desmond? What's up?" The groan was louder here. It was evolving, a song. It was singing. I looked up. Leo followed my eyes. He was standing directly beneath the main structural truss, looking at the blinking sensor light on its underside. "Just a loose sensor, probably," he said, tapping at his tablet. I didn't let him finish. I lunged forward and shoved him hard with both hands. He stumbled back with a cry of surprise, falling into a heap 10 feet down the corridor. In the same instant, the air was torn apart by a sound like a rifle shot magnified 1,000 times. Not a groan, but a sharp, metallic crack. I looked up to see the main support bracket for the truss shear clean off. Bolts rained down, clattering like shrapnel on the floor. The entire gantry, a 2-ton piece of steel and machinery, dropped from the ceiling. It slammed into the floor right where Leo had been standing, the impact shaking the entire station. The metal shrieked as it buckled, crushing the floor plates into a mangled ruin. The corridor filled with dust and the smell of severed wiring. I was on the floor, my ears ringing, staring at the wreckage. Leo was scrambling to his feet, his face ashen, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning, reverent awe. You knew," he breathed, staring at me. "Desmond, you knew that was going to happen. You saved my life." I couldn't answer. I looked at the mangled steel, then down at my own hands. I hadn't saved him. I had just followed an order from a ghost. My first gift had been an instinct. This one was a choice to trust the impossible, to obey the thing with the scarred face. And it had worked. The horror of that realization was sharper than the wreckage in front of me. I wasn't just infected, I was being guided. And my own desperate need to be a hero, to save the innocent, was the leash. The ringing in my ears subsided, replaced by the shouts of the approaching crew. They found us in the corridor, me, on the floor, Leo, pale and shaking, and the wreckage between us. Leo's words hung in the dusty air. He was wrong. I hadn't saved him. The ghost had. I was just the instrument, a puppet whose strings had been pulled by a scarred phantom. Gunnar was the first one to push through the gathering crowd. He didn't spare a glance for the mangled gantry or the structural damage. His eyes, burning with an intensity that was far more frightening than the accident itself, were fixed on me. "A mnemonic bleed of pure precognition," he said. He took out his data slate and began making notes. Not a skill, not a memory, direct, temporal foresight, remarkable. To Gunnar, I wasn't a man who had just survived a near-death experience. I was a fascinating new data point. Leo, meanwhile, was helping me to my feet. "I don't know how you did it, Desmond," he said, "but thank you." I couldn't meet his eyes. My gift felt like a contaminant, and his gratitude felt like an accusation. Over the next 2 days, the station fractured. A line was drawn in the ice. On one side were Leo and a handful of others who now looked at me with a kind of fearful awe. I was their good luck charm, their prophet. On the other side were Greta and the purists, who saw me as the epicenter of the infection. They moved around me in wide arcs, their conversations dropping to whispers when I entered a room. They had sealed off Mikhail's quarters, a voluntary quarantine that felt more like a prison sentence. They wanted me to be next. I couldn't stand it. The whispers, the stares, the hope in Leo's eyes. It was all too much. I sealed myself in my cabin. I turned off the live feed from the anomaly. I taped black paper over the porthole. I was trying to starve the ghost, to cut the connection by refusing to look, refusing to listen. The silence I had craved was now absolute. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a man holding his breath, waiting for the next whisper from the dark. I sat there for hours, staring at the blank walls, tracing the scar on the ghost's face in my mind. The bleeds had stopped, but I felt worse. I felt hollowed out, waiting. My savior complex had curdled into a crushing weight of responsibility. I had to fix this. But how could I fix something when the only tool I had was the disease itself? A sharp knock on my door made me jump. I didn't answer. The lock clicked, overridden by a master code. The door slid open, and Gunnar stepped inside, the light from the corridor carving a long rectangle into my self-imposed darkness. "Brooding isn't going to solve this, Desmond." He looked around my monastic, darkened cabin, his lip curling in disdain. "You're trying to suppress the primary symptom. That's like a biologist refusing to look through a microscope because he's afraid of what he might see." "It's not a symptom, Gunnar. It's a voice. It's someone. And it's using me." "Good," he shot back, his eyes glinting. "Let it. You're trying to treat this like a disease to be cured. You're thinking too small. This isn't a plague. It's a paradigm shift. And you, Desmond, with your unique sensitivity to the data, are the key." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "This bleed isn't a random pathology. It's a function, a direct line of communication. We don't need to shut it down. We need to open the throttle. We need to listen to what it's saying." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a controlled experiment," he said, his voice dropping, becoming seductive. "A deep dive. We take you down to the anomaly chamber. We hook you directly into the sensor array, bypass the safeties, and intentionally induce a powerful, sustained, mnemonic bleed. We don't just wait for a whisper. We demand that it speaks. We record the data state of your consciousness during the event. It could give us the key to everything. The structure of the bleed, its vector, maybe even a way to create a chronal vaccine. A way to immunize the others." He dangled the bait. A cure, a way to save everyone. The words resonated with the deepest, most flawed part of me. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's too dangerous. It's changing me. I can feel it." "Of course it's changing you." Gunnar scoffed, his patience snapping. "That's how discovery works. Do you think the first man to harness fire wasn't burned? You have a choice, Desmond. You can sit in this dark room and wait for the infection to pick you and everyone else apart. one accident at a time, or you can get on the slab and help me weaponize the phenomenon that chose you." He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "Leo trusts you. He thinks you're the hero who saved him. Are you going to be? Or are you just going to be the first one to die of a disease you were too afraid to study?" The door slid shut, leaving me alone in the dark again. But the darkness was no longer empty. It was filled with his words, his terrifying, compelling logic. He had taken my deepest fear and my most profound weakness, my need to save them all, and twisted them into a single, horrifying path forward. I could feel the leash again, but this time it wasn't a ghost pulling it. It was my own hope. For a long time after the door slid shut, I didn't move. Gunnar's words had laid a trap, and my own mind was walking right into it. Hero or the first to die? It was a brutal, manipulative choice. But he was right about one thing. Hiding in the dark, waiting for the station to be torn apart by another accident wasn't a plan. It was a slow suicide. I thought of Leo's face in the corridor, the dust settling around him, his eyes wide with a trust I hadn't earned and didn't deserve. I thought of Mikhail, locked in his room, terrified of his own hands. The ghost's warning had saved one of them. What would happen when the next warning came, and the next? Could I save them all? The desire was a deep, familiar ache. It was the core of me. The need to understand, to solve, to protect. Gunnar had offered me a path, a terrible one, but it was a path forward. The alternative was to do nothing, to let my fear make the choices for me. I stood up, the motions stiff, feeling like a much older man. I took the black paper off the porthole. The endless Antarctic night stared back. I wouldn't be the first to die of a disease I was too afraid to study. I would be the man who tried to find the cure. The elevator ride down to the anomaly chamber felt different this time. It wasn't a descent into a place of wonder, but a final, solemn journey. When the door opened, Gunnar was already there, his back to me. He was standing before the central console, rerouting power, disabling governors and safety protocols. He didn't look back as I approached, but I knew he'd been expecting me. "Good," he said, his eyes still on the screen. "I've recalibrated the emitter to generate a focused, resonant field. Instead of broadcasting it at the anomaly, we're going to use it as a receiver. Your brain will be the antenna." He gestured to a modified chair that had been moved to the center of the web of instruments. It looked like a dentist's chair redesigned for an execution. Wires and fiber optic cables snaked from its headrest, connecting it directly to the primary sensor array. My throat was tight, but I walked to the chair and sat down. "This is madness. All discovery is madness until it's a footnote in a textbook," Gunnar replied. He picked up a flexible metal circlet lined with small silver sensor pads. "This will feed the raw field data directly into your sensory cortex. Normally it would be filtered, translated into numbers on a screen. You're going to get the fire hose." He fitted the circlet to my head. The metal was cold against my temples. Each sensor pad pricked my skin with a tiny, sharp pressure. He worked with a surgeon's efficiency, his movements quick and certain. He was not a man wrestling with a moral dilemma. He was a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. The fact that my sanity was the variable being tested was irrelevant to him. "I'll be monitoring your neural activity," he said, plugging the final cable into the headrest. "The moment it becomes critical, I'll shut it down." I looked at him. There was no reassurance in his eyes. He would let me go to the very edge, maybe even a little over, for the data. "Do it," I said. He gave a single sharp nod and turned to the console. "Initiating sequence." The low tone of the emitter began to rise, but this time it wasn't just a sound in the room. It was a vibration inside my skull. The silver pads on my temples grew warm. A faint, dancing pattern of light like television snow flickered at the edges of my vision. "Field is active," Gunnar said, his voice sounding distant. "I'm seeing a significant spike in your occipital lobe activity." "What do you see, Desmond?" Lights, I managed to say. The snow was thickening, resolving into streams of flowing symbols, a language I'd never seen but somehow understood. It was the anomaly's data, raw and unfiltered. It was beautiful. I'm increasing the amplitude, Gunnar said. The streams became a flood. The flood became an ocean. I was drowning in information, not just data but moments. A flash of memory, my hands but wrinkled and liver-spotted, gripping the control yoke of a vehicle I'd never seen. Another flash, the taste of coffee in the station's mess hall, but the table was scarred with burn marks that weren't there yet. Another, the crushing weight of ice, the sound of my own ribs snapping, the cold burn of a death I hadn't experienced. It was too much. Gunnar, I gasped. Shut it! The word was cut off by a wrenching physical jolt. It wasn't just in my head. The entire chamber lurched, a violent tremor that threw me against the chair's restraints. A sound filled the air, not a sound my ears could hear, but a tearing sensation in the fabric of space itself. The lights in the chamber didn't just go out, they were extinguished, sucked into a perfect, silent vacuum. The power wasn't gone, it had never been. I was floating in an absolute sense-depriving void. And then the final clarifying bleed hit me. It wasn't a flash, it was a state of being. I was standing in the maintenance conduits. In my hand, I held a heavy, specialized wrench. Ahead of me was a structural support bracket, the one for the southern truss. I was looking at a single, critical bolt. I knew with a certainty that was absolute that if I loosened this bolt just a quarter turn, it would hold for another 12 hours before shearing. Just enough time for a young, naive comms officer to be sent to investigate a phantom sensor glitch. I felt the metal of the wrench in my palm. I felt my arm move, not with malice, but with a grim, surgical necessity. I felt the brutal, simple logic of the act. His near-death experience was required to earn the trust of my younger self. The vision dissolved. Reality, or what was left of it, snapped back. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a red glow over the chamber. The place was a wreck. Consoles were shattered, cables torn from the ceiling. Gunnar was on the floor, groaning, a gash on his forehead. And standing in the center of the room, no longer flickering, no longer a ghost, was the man with the scar. He was solid. He was real. The catastrophic shockwave had somehow anchored him to my timeline. He looked at me, trapped in the chair, and his expression was one of profound, weary pity. I stared back, the phantom memory of the wrench still in my hand. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. His lips moved, and this time the voice was perfectly clear. It was my own, just older, rougher, worn down by time and horrors I couldn't imagine. "I am not a ghost from your future," he said. "I am the man you are becoming. Every skill, every warning, I sent them. I have been building you." The words hung in the red, ruined air. My mind rejected them. It was a trick, a hallucination, the final desperate firing of a brain being torn apart by the experiment. The man before me was a monster, a phantom spat out by the anomaly. He couldn't be me. "No!" I choked out. The restraints on the chair bit into my wrists as I struggled against them. "You sabotaged the gantry. You tried to kill Leo." "I made sure Leo lived," he corrected, his voice calm, weary. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the shattered glass of a console screen. "I needed you to trust me. The warning was the price of that trust. You're a murderer. I am a survivor," he countered, his ancient eyes locking onto mine. He raised a hand as if to quiet a child. "You see one death. I have seen them all, every single one, 1,000 times over." He touched 2 fingers to my temple where the metal circlet still sat. The world vanished. There was no red light, no chamber. There was only a silent, screaming whiteness. I saw Icebreaker Station not just damaged, but gone. Erased. I felt the sensation of my own atoms unspooling, my consciousness dissolving into static. I witnessed a timeline where I had hesitated, where Leo had died under the gantry, and the resulting grief and panic had led to a different, catastrophic experiment that had annihilated everything. It wasn't a memory. It was an obituary. The vision lasted a second, but felt like an eternity. "That is just one path," he said. "One of countless variations, all leading to the same end. Erasure. A terminal paradox is not an explosion. It is the successful creation of a closed, stable, self-sustaining loop. The timeline we are in now. This one. It is the only one that doesn't end in that white silence. It is ugly, and it is bloody, and it is paved with bodies. But it exists, and I have walked it to its end." He reached behind me and with a click, released the restraints on the chair. My arms fell limp to my sides. I was free, but the gesture felt like a mockery. "I am not the monster, Desmond," he said, turning to look at the wreck of the chamber. "I am the answer to the monster. The causality parasite doesn't want to kill us. It wants to replicate. It wants to create a perfect eternal loop, and this timeline, this exact sequence of events, is its first success story." I pushed myself out of the chair, my legs unsteady. On the floor, Gunnar stirred, moaning. The gash on his head was bleeding freely onto the grated floor. My first instinct was to help him. "Leave him," the remnant ordered without looking at me. "His role is not over, but it is not your concern." I ignored him, stumbling over to where Gunnar lay. I knelt and felt for a pulse. It was there, thready but stable. As I touched his neck, I saw a future memory, unbidden. Gunnar, his eyes wide with a final, horrified understanding, standing before a power conduit just as it overloaded. He was another variable to be pruned. Another body paving the road. I stood up slowly, backing away from Gunnar, from the remnant, from the whole situation. I looked at the master comms panel, its screen cracked but still glowing. I tapped the emergency broadcast key. Nothing. Just a flat, dead hiss. "The shockwave wasn't just physical," the remnant said, reading my actions. "It severed us. We're not just out of contact, we're out of time. The station is a ship in a bottle, and the bottle has been sealed." We were alone. Truly, utterly alone. Trapped in a collapsing bubble of reality with my own future self, a man who saw murder as a form of temporal surgery. "So what now?" I asked. "You just enforce the script. You make sure everyone dies on schedule." "I make sure we survive," he corrected me, his gaze as hard and unforgiving as the Antarctic ice. "I follow the path I've already walked. Any deviation, any attempt you make to be the hero, to save someone who is meant to die, threatens to unravel the one single timeline where our consciousness continues to exist." He walked toward the doorway, his back to me. "Your idealism is a bomb, Desmond, and my job is to make sure you don't light the fuse." He stepped out of the chamber, leaving me in the red twilight with the unconscious form of my former mentor. I wasn't just fighting a ghost anymore. I was fighting fate itself, a cruel, bloody, predetermined fate that wore my own face. And the worst part was, for the first time, I could almost understand its logic. I stood there for a long time. My own future, a murderer with a savior's logic, had walked out, leaving me with a choice I didn't know how to make. Behind me, Gunnar coughed, a wet, rattling sound. My legs moved on their own, the old programming kicking in, help the injured. Find a solution. I half-dragged, half-carried Gunnar out of the chamber and toward the medbay. The elevator groaned its way up, a slow, painful ascent back to a world that had been broken while we were gone. The station was in chaos. The power surge had fried dozens of secondary systems. Alarms were blaring in distant pods, ignored. The crew moved with the frantic, panicked hustle of shipwreck survivors. Leo saw me emerge. His expression lit up in sudden relief, then twisted into confusion as he took in the scene. "Desmond, what happened? The whole station. It felt like it tore." He helped me get Gunnar onto a gurney. "The experiment, it failed," I said. The lie was thin, brittle. The next few hours were spent rerouting power, sealing bulkheads, and trying to keep the station from falling apart. We got Gunnar stabilized in the medbay. Greta barked orders, trying to restore power to critical sections. They all saw the wrecked anomaly chamber, my exhausted state, Gunnar's injury. They pieced together their own story. Desmond and Gunnar, the two scientists closest to the anomaly, pushed too hard and broke everything. They weren't entirely wrong, but I knew the truth. We weren't a crew anymore. We were variables in an equation, and the remnant was the one solving for the final, bloody answer. The station was a clockwork of doom, and I was the only one who could see the gears turning. I found myself standing by Gunnar's bedside later that day. His head was bandaged. He was awake, his eyes sharp and analytical despite the pain. The beeping of the vital signs monitor was a steady, rhythmic countdown. "The data," he whispered. "Did we get it?" "We got something," I said, the words tasting like poison. "Gunnar, listen to me. The power systems are unstable. The conduits are unpredictable. You need to stay away from them." The phantom memory of his death flashed in my mind. The burst of light, the smell of cooked electronics. A certainty settled in my gut. The kind that comes before a final, inescapable impact. I had to try. He looked at me, and a hint of pity crossed his features. "The shock was too much for you, Desmond. A full-blown psychotic break. You need rest." He tried to sit up, wincing. The overload in the server hub, the gantry failure, and now this. "There's a pattern, a waveform. I can map it. The data from your episode is the key. I just need to get to an engineering terminal." "No, you can't. Just stay here." My warning was a fool's errand. I was telling a drowning man not to study the unique properties of the water filling his lungs. He saw my concern not as a warning, but as a symptom of my own weakness. "You tried to hide from it, and it broke you," he said, his voice regaining its condescending edge. "I'm going to face it head on. That's the difference between us." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his movements slow but determined. I stepped in his path. "Gunnar, don't—" The remnant's words rang in my mind. "Any attempt you make to be the hero threatens to unravel the timeline." My trying to save Gunnar felt like the right thing to do, the human thing. But what if it was just another move on the board, anticipated by the monster who used to be me? What if my pleading was the very thing that solidified his resolve? He pushed past me, his shoulder bumping mine. He saw a frightened, broken man. He had no idea I was a prophet, delivering a doomed oracle. "I am not going to let fear dictate the most important discovery in human history," he said, and walked out of the medbay. I watched him go. He was heading for the engineering pod, the one that housed the primary power conduits. I stood frozen, a spectator at a tragedy I had written. I had tried to stop him, and in doing so, I had ensured his fate. All I could do now was wait for the sound of the execution. The lights in the medbay flared, turning an incandescent, painfully pure white for a single, searing heartbeat. In that flash, every shadow in the room vanished. It was followed by a sharp, resonant crack that vibrated through the floor plates, a sound like the universe's own spine snapping. Then the lights died completely. We were plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eyes. A second later, the piercing shriek of the station's most critical alarm tore through the silence. This wasn't a fire alarm or a pressure warning. This was a central systems failure alarm. The sound of the station dying. Red emergency lights strobed on, casting everything in a frantic, pulsing gloom. I hadn't moved. I hadn't even flinched. The event landed inside me with a quiet finality. A gear had turned. A piece had been removed from the board. It was done. A figure filled the doorway, a silhouette against the strobing red of the corridor. The remnant. He stepped into the room, the emergency light catching the pale line of the scar on his face. "You see now?" he said, his voice level, almost gentle. He was a rogue variable. His hunger for new data, his refusal to accept the rules, threatened to destabilize the loop. He would have broken it, and we would have been erased. "You killed him," I said, the words numb. "The timeline killed him," the remnant corrected. "He was on a path that led to a dead end. I simply let him walk it. Your attempt to stop him was also part of the design. It confirmed his belief that he was right and you were weak. It cemented his resolve. Every piece has its purpose, Desmond. Even our good intentions." He took a step closer. "I am not your jailer. I am your guide through the only narrow, bloody path that leads to tomorrow. Stop fighting the current. Stop trying to save people who are already dead. You are only making it harder on yourself." He turned and was gone, leaving me alone in the screaming red silence. The rest of the crew was in a state of terminal panic. There were only a dozen of us left now. Greta, her face streaked with grease, was trying to bypass the fried conduits. The others just huddled in the mess hall, their professionalism stripped away, leaving only raw animal fear. Leo found me there by the hydroponics bay. The little plants he had tended so carefully were wilting under the failing light. "Gunnar," he started, his voice cracking. "They're saying he was in the engineering pod." I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just nodded. "This is all connected, isn't it?" Leo said, his eyes searching mine for an answer, for any kind of hope. "The gantry, Mikhail's bleed, now this. And you're at the center of it. What's happening, Desmond? Please, just tell me." Before I could form a lie, the station gave a violent, shuddering lurch. It wasn't the groan of the stilts adjusting. This was a deep structural convulsion, a spasm that ran through the entire station. A section of the ceiling panels tore loose, crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks and insulation. The floor beneath us pitched like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. I grabbed a table to steady myself. Leo was thrown against the hydroponics bay, the glass cracking under the impact. Another lurch, more violent this time. The strobing red lights flickered and died, plunging us into true unbreathing darkness. The alarms stopped, and the world went utterly silent. We were falling. Not through space, but through time itself. This was it, the final catastrophic collapse. The station was spiraling toward its terminal paradox, the end of the line. The darkness was absolute. The brief, violent sensation of falling had stopped, leaving us in a dead, weightless equilibrium. We were unmoored, a ship becalmed in an ocean between seconds. "Desmond?" Leo's voice was a thin, panicked thread in the suffocating blackness. A low groan of stressed metal answered him. Then a sharp sound, the hydroponics bay cracking under a new strain, another violent lurch, shorter this time. It was followed by the shriek of tearing metal and a heavy thud. Then silence again, but broken now by a new sound. A ragged moan of pain. Leo's. I pushed myself off the table I'd clung to, my hands reaching out into the black, trying to find him. My fingers brushed against a tangle of wiring, then metal, then something warm and wet. My hand came away sticky. My fingers traced a shape in the dark. It was the hydroponics gantry, torn from the wall. Beneath it, I found his leg. I felt the unnatural angle of the bone beneath his jumpsuit, the rough edge where it had broken through the skin. As my hand touched the wound, a jolt went through me, an electric shock of foreign knowledge. It wasn't a vision, it was a blueprint. I saw myself stripping a power cable for its copper wire to fashion a tourniquet. I saw myself prying the backup battery from a fallen emergency light, using its charge to heat a shard of metal and cauterize the worst of the bleeding. It was a complex, risky, desperate procedure, but I knew with an alien certainty that it would work. I could save him. The knowledge filled me with a terrifying confidence. My hands began to move, to search for the tools the bleed had shown me. "Don't!" The voice came from the darkness behind me. It was calm and absolute. The emergency lights chose that moment to flicker back to life, their power drawn from some final, dying reserve. They cast a weak, unsteady red glow, just enough to see by. And he was there. The remnant stood a few feet away, solid and real, a fixture in the ruin of the station. I stared at him, my hands frozen over Leo's wound. "Let him die, Desmond," the remnant said. He pointed a weary finger at Leo's pale, pain-racked face. "His death is the keystone, the final, necessary trigger. In this timeline, he dies here. His death causes Greta to panic, to reroute the last of the station's power in a way that stabilizes the core paradox. It is his death that makes my memory of this moment, and every moment after, stable. It is the final bloody piece that locks the loop." He was not pleading. He was explaining a law of physics. I looked down at Leo. His breathing was shallow. His eyes were open, fixed on me, filled with a desperate, trusting hope that was a physical pain to witness. Then I looked at the remnant, at the monster my survival would cost. At his face, my face, worn down into a monument of pragmatism and grief. He was right. I knew he was right. I could feel the brutal logic of it, a theorem written in blood. The choice was clear. Become the monster and live forever in this hell, or watch the last flicker of innocence in this place die at my feet. And in that moment, seeing the two paths laid out before me, the monster and the martyr, I finally understood. The choice itself was the cage. The parasite didn't care which I picked. Both outcomes fed the loop. Both led to its eternal, repeating life. The only way to kill it, to truly win, was to refuse to play. A strange calm settled over me. The fear, the panic, the crushing weight of my own flawed need to be a hero. It all fell away, leaving a single, pure point of clarity. "You're wrong," I said. I wasn't speaking to the remnant anymore. I was speaking to the ghost in the machine. "You're just a pattern, a viral theorem, and every pattern has a source code." I was patient zero, the first point of contact. My mind was the nexus through which the parasite had entered our reality. It had used that link to feed me its poison. But a link goes both ways. I closed my eyes. I didn't try to save Leo. I didn't fight the remnant. I let go of the physical world, of the strobing red lights and the smell of blood. I reached inward, into the network of mnemonic bleeds, into the very structure of the thing that was overwriting my soul. I followed the threads back past the dead, back past the warnings, back past the first bleed in the anomaly chamber. I followed them all the way back to the beginning. I was in the chamber again, young, hopeful, my face bathed in the green light of the console. I watched myself stare in awe at the perfect, beautiful wave pattern on the screen, the moment of infection, the moment the parasite was born. From across time, from the ruin of the future, I reached out. I didn't try to stop the experiment. I corrupted it. Into the stream of pristine, elegant data that was creating the anomaly's first stable resonance, I injected a single, nonsensical variable. A paradox of my own. I pushed the memory of the remnant's scarred face, the feeling of the wrench in my hand, the entire, horrifying sum of this dead-end timeline, into the data of its own creation. The beautiful wave on the screen stuttered. It tried to resolve the input, an effect appearing within its own cause. For a moment, it thrashed wildly. Then, it flatlined. The connection snapped. The past, the present, and the future collapsed in on themselves. The pattern, faced with a paradox it could not solve, erased itself. The red light of the dying station did not wink out. It simply ceased to be. The feeling of Leo's broken leg under my hands vanished. The remnant's weary face dissolved. My own consciousness, my memories, my name. It all unraveled, like a knot being pulled loose, returning to the simple, unbroken thread of a timeline where a station called Icebreaker was never built, where a team of scientists never went to the South Pole, and a man named Desmond Paris never existed. There was no bang. There was no white light. There was only a sudden, perfect, and profound silence. My doctors call it a dissociative fugue state, a symptom of a mild, undiagnosed epilepsy. That's the neat, clinical box they put it in. It's easier than saying they don't know. They are episodes of unearned memory. Sometimes it's just a sensory ghost, the sudden phantom feeling of profound cold, so deep it feels like it's in my bones, even on a warm summer day. Other times, it's a flash of a skill I don't possess. I was fixing a leaky faucet last month and my hands moved with a plumber's certainty, tightening a nut I didn't know existed, stopping the drip instantly. I stared at my own hands for a full minute afterward, a stranger in my own body. My name is Desmond Paris. I teach introductory physics at a community college. My life is small, and I have made it that way on purpose. I was brilliant once, I think. I have phantom memories of understanding complex data models, of feeling a sense of awe at the universe's grand machinery. Now the thought of ambition, of looking too deeply into the patterns of the world, fills me with a thick, sour dread. I steer my students away from the big questions. I keep my lessons grounded, simple, safe. I am a man who has looked over a cliff and now chooses to live his life in a windowless room. Sometimes I see echoes of people I feel I should know. Last year, I saw Gunnar on the news. He's a celebrated theoretical physicist now, proposing some radical new theory about vacuum energy. Watching him speak, with his burning eyes and his ruthless certainty, I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit down. I felt a visceral animal need to get away from him, a man I have never met. More often I think of a young man with an earnest smile. I don't have a name for him, just a feeling. I saw him once, years ago, pushing a stroller in a park. He was laughing, pointing out a dog to the child. A sense of profound, aching relief washed over me, so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. He glanced in my direction, a stranger's fleeting look, and for a second, I felt like the world was safe because he was. I don't know why. The memory of his happiness is the only thing that makes the phantom cold in my bones feel worth it. My doctors say I should document the episodes to try and find a pattern. They don't understand that a pattern is the last thing in the world I want to find. I live my life in a state of willful ignorance, a carefully curated quarantine from my own mind. I have traded wonder for safety. I have chosen a small, quiet life. It is my penance for a sin I don't remember committing. This morning I woke to find frost on my bedroom window, a breathtakingly intricate web of ferns and stars etched in ice, a marvel of crystalline geometry. The old me, the one who whispers to me in my dreams, would have stared at it for hours, lost in the beauty of the math, the silent, elegant language of the universe. I looked at it for a single, long second. I felt the old awe rising in my throat, and right behind it, the cold, familiar dread. I picked up a cloth from my nightstand and wiped the glass clean.